Hello YouTube! In this video we're going to talk about death. Most people think that death is bad, but there are some philosophers who have proposed that there are strategies we can use to reduce the badness of death. So there's not really any need for us to fear death because we can make death innocuous. We can make it so that death doesn't necessarily have to harm us. So the first thing to say about this is that we're going to focus on the supposed harm that death does to the individual who dies. I mean, clearly I can reduce the harm that my death will do to other people. I don't know, I can behave sensibly in my life and properly set my affairs in order so that my loved ones receive a good inheritance or something. But, many of us think that death will be bad not just for the people who love us, but also for ourselves. It's bad for me when I die. I fear my own death because of what it means for me, not just what it means for others. So that's the kind of harm that we're going to focus on here. Now, of course, whether we can reduce the harm of death depends on what exactly it is that the harm of death consists in. And there's a lot of different views about this, but one fairly popular view is that one of the central goods of life is desire satisfaction. In fact, there are some philosophers who hold that well-being, just in general, consists entirely in desire satisfaction. In which case, death is harmful because it thwarts our desires. So I want to achieve various things, but I will surely die before those things are achieved. I also have desires to experience certain things that I already have, but then just to sort of carry on experiencing them indefinitely. So, it might be that, I currently have access to lots of good food and I just want to continue being able to eat good food. Or it might be that I'm very wealthy and I just want to continue being wealthy and I want to continue having the things I have. And in that case, death is going to deprive me of those things. Now, there are, of course, many different theories of well-being. We don't necessarily need to say that desire satisfaction is all that there is to well-being to agree that desire satisfaction is a component of well-being. So all we need to say here is just, generally speaking, we are benefited when our desires are fulfilled and we are harmed when our desires are thwarted. And that can be the case even if there are goods and evils in addition to desire satisfaction and desire frustration. And the thing is that on this view, death is going to be genuinely harmful in itself to the individual who dies. But at the same time, this suggests a strategy for eliminating, or at least reducing, the harm of death, which is that we simply modify our desires and goals in such a way that death can no longer thwart them. Philosophers call this thanatization. To thanatize your desires means to change your desires in such a way that they become compatible with your annihilation. And if you do that, then death is not going to be quite so harmful. I mean, it does seem that, in principle, harm can be reduced by altering your desires in the right kind of way. So let's take a more everyday example, right? Let's suppose that I strongly desire the approval of my cousin, and this is somebody who I deeply admire, but who's just completely dismissive of me. And I expend a great deal of energy trying to shape myself in a way that I think is going to earn her approval. I learn what her interests are. I make an effort to incorporate these into my own life. Suppose that my cousin loves football, so I play football even though I don't really like football. And it's all just in the hope that she's going to pay more attention to me. It's like I want her approval. I want her to notice me. And unfortunately, my efforts are completely futile. It seems clear that this is bad for me in some sense. It's bad for me in this scenario that my cousin does not care about me. I am in some sense harmed by her lack of interest. But there's also an obvious way to remove that harm, which is to just give up the desire for approval. If I don't desire her approval, then it's of no concern to me whether she likes me or not. Or suppose that I'm obsessed with preserving a youthful appearance, and in pursuit of this goal I undergo expensive surgeries while rigidly controlling my lifestyle in ways that make me miserable. And of course, my efforts are in vain because I age anyway. The loss of youthful beauty harms me, but I can remove that harm, I can eliminate that harm by giving up that desire to remain youthful. So the general point is that when a harm is contingent on my desires, I can alter my desires in a way which would remove or prevent the harm. And so maybe this could be done for death. Now there is an immediate concern about all of this, which is, we might wonder, well, is it really possible for us to just choose what to desire? I mean, it's not as if I can simply pick out my desires in the way that I might pick out what shirt to wear in the morning. Desires are not under that kind of direct voluntary control. But it does seem that desire can be controlled more or less indirectly. So again, take the case where I'm yearning for the approval of my cousin, right? Well, no doubt, this is a desire that would not be, you wouldn't be able to drop it with the snap of a finger. But there are strategies that you might be able to use to reduce the force of that desire. So maybe I reflect intellectually on the fact that there's nothing special about my cousin. I can consider all of the ways in which she's flawed, or all of the ways in which her own achievements are due to luck, and so on. And then if I keep reflecting on this, on this kind of thing, I'm maybe going to end up coming to think, okay, well, there's nothing really particularly special about this person, so maybe I don't really need her approval anyway. I can just start pursuing my own projects. I can spend time on things that have nothing to do with her, and that will, again, just by kind of focusing on things that have nothing to do with her, again, that maybe will shape my desires in a particular way. Or I can spend my time with other people who do care about me, other people who do value me, and so on. And if I work at all of these strategies enough, I'll probably just stop thinking about the cousin, right? This is all, I think, perfectly psychologically plausible as a way that things might go. So I mean, in principle, then, it seems that desires can be modified, and then that leaves us with the question: well, in what way exactly should we modify them? Well, pretty clearly, what we need to do is focus on desires that cannot be frustrated by death. So Stephen Looper, he has a couple of articles on this topic, one called Annihilation, the other called Adaptation. And Looper suggests that there are three types of desire that are impervious to death. First of all, there are what he calls escape desires, which are desires that you cease to exist under certain circumstances. So I might have the desire to die if I'm in extreme, endless pain. Now, in such a case, right, if that condition is satisfied, if I'm in extreme, endless pain, and I desire to die if I'm in extreme, endless pain, then arguably my death does not harm me in that case. And I mean, a lot of people do have this desire. A lot of people would say, yeah, I don't want to be in an extreme, endless pain. I'd take death over that. So there are escape desires, right? Second, there are independent desires, desires whose object is completely independent of whatever I do, independent of whether I live or die. So, for example, the desire that the moon orbit the Earth. It's a rather odd kind of desire, I suppose, but this is the sort of thing that my death has no bearing on. So my death does not threaten the satisfaction of this desire. Finally, there are conditional desires, desires that are conditional on my being alive. So I desire to be physically active at 100 years old if I'm still alive at that time. But maybe I don't worry about whether I actually make it to 100. My desire is just that, look, if I do make it to 100, I want to be physically active. If I do make it to 100, I don't want to be bound to a bed, right? So, these desires are desires that are not going to be thwarted by my death. So can we then maybe think about what things would look like if we were to try to adopt only these death-resistant desires? So, of course, one option is to conditionalize all of your desires. Conditional desires are interesting because they do suggest here a very general strategy for thanatization. Because, I mean, in principle, it does look like almost all of our desires could be conditionalized. Take, for instance, my desire to eat chocolate cake for dessert today? Well, if I die before eating dessert, that desire is going to be frustrated. But then I might just conditionalize the desire. I might have the desire to eat chocolate cake for dessert unless I die before dessert, right? So I desire to eat chocolate cake for dessert if I'm still alive at the time. And I can just add that qualification to basically any desire, right? I desire to go to the beach with Verity tomorrow if I'm still alive. I desire to achieve a philosophy PhD if I'm still alive, at the sort of time that would be achieved, etc., right? There's all kinds of, any desire, you can just add that. Maybe if I'm still alive, or maybe you'd say, unless I die beforehand. So I desire to achieve a philosophy PhD unless I die beforehand, right? And it seems I could apply this strategy across the board to basically all of my desires. One of the things that's appealing about this strategy is that at first glance it seems not to involve any major changes to my psychological profile, because after conditionalizing all of my desires, I'm going to have, basically the same desires that I already do have. I've just added a death clause to them. So Luper says that things are not quite so simple here. It's not going to be such a small change. So he says that conditionalizing runs into the problem that in many cases, the way he puts it is, none of us has the capacity to care intensely, yet within sharply defined temporal boundaries. So conditionalizing, it promises to sort of maintain your desires as they actually are. It promises to involve only a very minor change to your psychological profile. Luper says, no, this is an illusion, because there are many desires that have a kind of intensity that makes them sort of unbounded, and in a way that's just kind of incompatible with like saying that they get cut off at your death. Consider love. To love another person is to be concerned for their well-being in general, not just their well-being while you are alive. I mean, imagine if your parents were to tell you that they have no interest in helping you secure your long-term future, because they don't care what happens to you after they die. Right? Yeah, I mean, it's like, yeah, they'll help you out while you're alive. I mean, they like you. They love you. I mean, maybe they'll even say, look, we love you. We love you very much. And so, we're going to help you out. But look, once I'm dead, that's it. I'm gone. And, then that's it, right? So once I'm dead, I'm not going to be concerned about helping you out after I'm dead, right? If they were to have that kind of view, I think you'd say, well, you don't really love me then, do you? Now, I suppose there are plenty of parents who do have this attitude to their children, but then what we say, well, it kind of seems like you don't love your kids. So it seems like conditionalizing may well be incompatible with genuine love, and so that would be, for many people, a very great loss. Another issue here is that it's actually not really so obvious how conditionalizing is supposed to work, even when it comes to the simpler desires. So, like the desire to eat chocolate cake. So I say, well, I conditionalize my desire to eat chocolate cake for dessert, so I have the desire to eat chocolate cake for dessert unless I die beforehand. Now, what is that? What is that desire? I mean, I know what it is to desire chocolate cake. I feel myself pulled towards a chocolate cake. I want to have this gustatory experience. Maybe my mouth starts watering, etc. Most of the time, when I'm thinking about chocolate cake, I'm not thinking about death. I'm just thinking about the cake. And so, if I take my current desire for chocolate cake and then I conditionalize it against death, what exactly is supposed to change? Do I have to kind of consciously add the caveat, if I'm still alive or unless I die? So like when I think about the chocolate cake and I start salivating, do I have to consciously like remind myself, well, you want that unless you, it's like, I want that unless I die beforehand. Well, if conditionalization requires me to consciously think about death like that, then it seems like conditionalization is a fairly major sacrifice, because then I would be required to think about death basically all of the time. And, who wants to think about one topic all of the time? I mean, I don't want to have to think about death when I'm just, thinking about how I'm going to enjoy a really tasty chocolate cake after dinner. So that doesn't seem like a very plausible option. And also, I mean, all these thoughts about death, if you were just thinking about death all the time, you'd probably just kind of get in the way of other things that you want to think about. But if that's not it, right? If conditionalizing your desire doesn't involve consciously thinking to yourself, if I'm still alive, then what is it, right? What signifies the change that occurs when you take one of your desires and you conditionalize it against death? So if you're not gonna, if that's not going to involve consciously thinking a caveat like if I'm still alive or unless I die, then what does distinguish the unconditional desire, I desire chocolate cake for dessert, from the conditionalized desire, I desire chocolate cake for dessert if I'm still alive, or I desire chocolate cake for dessert unless I die beforehand? That doesn't seem at all obvious. There's a further question about conditionalization, which is, why stop at death? I mean, many things can thwart our desires. If desires are so easily conditionalized, why not conditionalize them against just anything that would threaten them? So then I could say, I desire chocolate cake for dessert unless anything happens that thwarts the desire. I desire to go to the beach with Verity tomorrow unless anything happens to thwart the desire. I desire to achieve a philosophy PhD unless anything happens to thwart the desire. I mean, this now really does maybe start to look like it might be incompatible with, the sort of deep attachments that are involved when you have like love or friendship and so on. I mean, imagine saying this about, a person that you love, you desire to be around them unless anything happens to prevent that. That seems, I don't know, would that be love? So the thing is here, with this sort of approach is, it looks like what we're saying is, you do not care whether the desire is satisfied. So this involves something like a kind of radical detachment from your own desires. We're going to come back to that idea. But the key thing is, if conditionalization is a reasonable strategy when it comes to death, then I think, it's like, well, yeah, why stop there? I mean, why not just conditionalize against anything, and then you end up with something that's maybe not so much conditionalization but more total detachment from your own desires. As I said, that's a point that we will come back to, but for now I just want to give a quick advert. So if you like my videos, I have a Patreon, and I have a whole bunch of bonus videos on that Patreon. So if you want to see more of me, more of my ideas about things, then you can sign up there and access that. Or you could just send me some cash via PayPal. Obviously, if you can offer anything, either way, I really appreciate it. And yeah, now I do also have shirts available, which have been selling, although the shirts are limited edition, and there's maybe not that many left at this point. So, but there are some shirts available if you would like them. So you can go to that place, that link I just gave there, and check out. There you go. There's some, meat eater and vegan shirts also for that vegan video I did recently. Anyway, let's get back to the death stuff. So again, we said there were these three types of desire. There were escape desires, independent desires, and conditional desires. Now, I think we can probably rule out the idea of basing a life entirely around escape desires, because these desires only specify circumstances under which you would want to die. As we have seen, conditionalizing all of your desires does run into some problems, but this still leaves independent desires. Desires whose object is independent of whatever it is that I do. So you might think that you could thanatize all your desires by just dropping the dependent desires. So maybe you just have only independent desires. Now many independent desires are going to seem quite strange and alienating. I mean, it would be very odd if all of your desires were along the lines of the desire that the moon orbit the Earth. But there is perhaps one class of independent desire that initially might seem a bit more appealing. So these are what we might think of certain altruistic desires. Desires for the happiness of others. So the desire that another person lives a good life. My own death does not necessarily get in the way of this. And it does seem to be generally acknowledged that at least one path to a rich and happy life involves expanding one's concerns from, entirely self-interested matters to the world at large, right? So it's just generally the case, I think, that, if you're the sort of person who is sort of, you have some concern for other people and you're not just focused entirely on the pursuit of self-interest, then you're actually, that's one path to happiness, and you're probably going to be more happy than somebody who is just entirely focused on self-interested things. So this is perhaps going to kill two birds with one stone. It's going to remove the harm of death and make one's own life better. Although, of course, I suppose if you're pursuing this strategy, you probably don't want to be killing birds with stones. But anyway, there are we might think, look, there's certain types of altruistic desires for the good of other people, that you could have. And if you just have, if all of your desires become desires for the good of other people, maybe you can thanatize your desires that way. Now, there are some concerns about this strategy. One immediate problem is that if the concern is reducing the harm posed by death, then adopting altruistic desires arguably trades one harm for an even greater harm, because if I thanatize in this kind of way, then I'm going to be less harmed by my own death, but I'm going to be much more greatly harmed by the deaths of other people. And of course there will be far more deaths of other people than there will be deaths of me. Let's say that I desire the flourishing of humanity as a whole or something, right? And where that just has nothing to do with what benefits me. I just desire the flourishing of humanity as a whole, just for its own sake, right? Well, humanity is one day going to go extinct, and of course I know this. I know that billions upon billions of people are going to die, and eventually humanity is just going to cease to exist entirely. And all of these deaths are now going to be bad from my own point of view. They're going to be bad for me, because it's going to involve my desires being thwarted. So it looks like I'm going to be harmed by this. I mean, maybe I'm going to be harmed by this even more than I would be harmed if I just was concerned for my own life, and my own life gets eliminated. Because there's just so many more people dying, right? But in any case, it's not really clear that this actually avoids the harm of death. It just seems to sort of shunt it to a different place. Here's another concern. We need to keep in mind that independent desires go far beyond what we might think of as a kind of ordinary concern for others. Some altruistic desires are independent desires, but many are not. And probably most of the altruistic desires that you currently have, if you do indeed have any, are actually not independent desires. Remember that a desire is independent only if there is nothing that I can do to realize it. So that, what happens to me makes no difference to whether the desire is satisfied. So if I'm going to adopt only independent desires, I need to adopt only those altruistic desires where I have no ability to bring about the object of the desire. On this strategy then, if I have the power to influence things one way or the other, my desires have not been thanatized. So suppose, for instance, that I have no particular concern for myself, and I do desire good things for verity, right? Well, probably there are many things I can do to provide good things for verity. If verity is a friend, then, there's all sorts of things I can do to make verity's life better. So my death does in fact threaten my desire. It does threaten to thwart my desire because it's going to prevent me from doing good things for verity. I think that part of what's appealing about altruism, right, is the thought of making a commitment to a project that's beyond your own interests, beyond your own perspective. It's about making a contribution to something greater than yourself. And, maybe there's not much you can do. So let's say that you adopt the commitment to world peace. Well, world peace, that's a pretty tough goal. It's going to be largely out of your hands. There's not much you can do for world peace. But actually, all of us could do something towards it. Any person can do things just within their own community to make their own communities more peaceful, and that is a very tiny contribution, but it's still a contribution to world peace. You are doing something to realize that goal. Now, the point is that if what you find appealing about altruism is the idea of committing and making a contribution to something greater than yourself, then that is not something that you're going to get with these independent altruistic desires. Indeed, we might wonder really whether these independent altruistic desires are really altruistic at all, because what it would have to be is it would have to be a desire like, this person who lives in a completely different country who I will never interact with has a good life. Like, I desire that this person who I never interact with has a good life, where I'm recognizing that I'm not doing anything for that person. Indeed, I can't do anything for that person. Is that really altruism? I mean, I'm not so sure. So, anyway, the point is that as with conditionalizing, this strategy is more radical than it might seem at first glance. There's actually another point about this independent strategy, which is that unlike conditionalizing, it can't be done globally or algorithmically. So with conditionalizing, I can kind of thanatize my desires in one fell swoop. I just add a death clause to every desire. Dropping all of the dependent desires is going to have to be more piecemeal. I need to look at each desire, ask whether it's, dependent on what happens to me. And that's going to be a pretty long-term project. I mean, it might take a while before I figure out which desires are which. So, again, one of the nice things about conditionalizing is it's global in a sense, in a way that this strategy is not. But there is another global method, and we mentioned it at the end of the section on conditionalizing, which is detachment from desire. So the idea of detachment is fairly simple. I have all of the same desires that I currently do, and I don't really even necessarily conditionalize them against death, right? I'm not conditionalizing them against death. I just have the same desires I currently do, but I just care about them much, much less. I stop being concerned about whether those desires are satisfied. So, as I suggested earlier, you could see this as a kind of global conditionalizing of one's desires against all possible ways that the desire could be thwarted. Another way to think about this is maybe in terms of higher order desires about desires. So I may have the desire to eat chocolate cake, this is a first order desire, but then I may have the desire not to desire chocolate cake. I may have the desire to be the kind of person who isn't tempted by chocolate cake. This is a higher order desire because it's a desire about the desire. And it could be that I identify more closely with this higher order desire. So I focus on resisting the chocolate temptation and developing new tastes. Along similar lines, I may desire to be the kind of person who's just not really moved by any first order desires. I may desire to be the kind of person where desire satisfaction isn't something I care about much. So we can say, look, desire satisfaction just shouldn't matter that much in general, so you detach from your desires. It's clearly true that people can be more or less attached to their own desires. Consider a child who throws a tantrum when they are told that they cannot have an expensive new toy. I think we would all recognise that this is a pathological behaviour, and a lot of people would say that this is something that should be trained out of the child. And not just for the sake of other people who might be distressed by the tantrum, but also for the child's own good, because it's just, toys aren't really that important, and you're going to have a really miserable life if you respond to the slightest setback so negatively. If you're so deeply disturbed by experiencing just some setback, things are going to really suck for you. You're not going to have a pleasant time. It is possible to take the frustration of one's own desires with equanimity. And maybe this kind of thing occurs when we play games. Every time I play a game of cards, I desire to win. But if I lose, it doesn't really matter. Losing is just as much fun as winning. Indeed, things would get boring if I was to win every time. So every time I play the game of cards, I do desire to win, and I try to win. I make a real good effort to win. I do the best I can to win. That guides how I play the game. But in some sense, I'm detached from that desire because the satisfaction of that desire actually doesn't matter to me. It doesn't matter whether I win or lose. Okay, so this is detachment. Now, I've already suggested that detachment may be incompatible with goods like, love and friendship. If Luper is right that conditionalizing against death is incompatible with these, then it seems clear that detachment would be as well. And certainly, if the analogy that we're making to the detachment strategy is, playing a game of cards, well, do we really want to say that, some relationship that you have with your loved ones is just like playing a game of cards, where it's like, yeah, I desire that they continue to live and that they have good lives, but if they end up just with cancer, then well, whatever. Like, yeah, okay, you don't want to, do you really want to approach things with that degree of equanimity? So if we worry about the conditionalizing strategy because of how it might be incompatible with these goods, then it seems like maybe we should worry about the detachment strategy too. Another point, though, is that I think there's something rather odd about the detachment strategy in the context of thanatization. Recall that what motivates thanatization is a desire satisfaction account of well-being. So to have the goal of thanatization in the first place, you must think that death is bad and that the badness of death has to do with the way in which desires are frustrated. But now, in order for you to enact detachment from desire, you have to think that desires just don't matter much, that it isn't important whether any of your desires are satisfied. So basically, it seems the motivation for thanatization is in tension with the method for achieving thanatization. If I really believe that my desires don't matter much, why bother with thanatization in the first place? Death can't actually harm me anyway. On the other hand, if desires do matter, then thanatization via detachment from desire would be a kind of self-deception. I would know full well that my desires are important, that my desires matter, but then I would have to convince myself that they don't matter in order to stop myself from being afraid of death. And that just seems like I'm intentionally deceiving myself. I'd be trading the harm of death for the harm of self-deception. So anyway, maybe there's a concern here that this strategy just doesn't really even make any sense in the context of thanatization. Anyway, those were some strategies for thanatization and some concerns that might arise for each specific strategy. I now want to turn to some general objections to the thanatization project. So first of all, it's worth noting just a practical limitation. Let's say we grant that desires can in principle be thanatized and that it would be worth it to thanatize them. Well, clearly thanatization cannot occur in the snap of a finger. This is a project that's going to take a great deal of work. But death can happen at any time. So death is going to remain a harm while the thanatization project is underway. It's well and good to say that in principle we could eliminate the harm of death by, making all of our desires conditional desires. But actually enacting this is another matter entirely. As we've seen, all of these strategies do involve pretty radical changes to your psychological profile. So it's going to take a great deal of practice, maybe something like meditation, to achieve this. It's going to take an amount of time and effort that just might not be realistic for most people. And if that's the case, we might wonder whether thanatization really is of as much practical value as it might initially seem. Like if it turns out that thanatization is in principle possible, but just not really actually practically possible for most people, then, well, who cares about this? A second worry, and I suppose we've already hinted at this in the discussion of the specific methods, but it's worth making it explicit, is that thanatization may threaten certain goods that are associated with desire satisfaction, in particular the motivational force of desire and the pleasures associated with getting things done. So the problem is that whatever method we choose, it seems that we are no longer going to feel the imperative of I must do this thing no matter what, right? So there are certain things that we desire so strongly and we kind of feel like I must achieve this no matter what happens. But if we go for this thanatization project, that sense, that tenacity, that sense of I must achieve this is going to go away. Because you're not going to say I must achieve this no matter what, because you're going to say, well, yeah, I mean, I want to achieve this, but if I die, oh well, it doesn't matter. So we're no longer going to be so tenaciously driven to achieve our goals. There's 2 points here. First of all, there are many projects that actually seem to require that kind of tenacity just because they're so difficult to pull off. Think about what's involved in making a film, with the huge amount of time, money, effort, the organization of large numbers of people involved, people who in many ways will be pulling against your artistic vision. I mean, if you're like a film director and you have some very clear artistic vision, that's going to require a huge amount of tenacity. That's a huge amount of work, and you're not just going to be able to be like nonchalant about getting it done or not, right? You really have to feel like this must be done. I must do whatever I can to achieve this. And second, there are arguably certain pleasures that only become available through enacting these like great efforts. It's precisely because certain projects tax us deeply that we feel a great satisfaction upon achieving them. Now, I should note, of course, that from some points of view, these kinds of goals and pleasures are not particularly valuable anyway. You might well think that the best kind of pleasure is something more like a kind of tranquil contentment. Intense pleasure makes us worse off even when we're experiencing it. So it really isn't a problem that the thanatization strategy causes us to lose it. I guess the question for those who accept a desire satisfaction account of well-being is, well, what exactly is it about desire that's valuable? And might this be threatened by thanatization? If we think of desire as valuable because of its association with these sorts of things, like this tenacious motivation, the intense pleasures that can follow as a result of satisfying such desires, then thanatization may be less appealing. Okay, so another challenge is that thanatization may, in one way or another, be self-defeating. Again, we've kind of hinted at this a bit before, but it's worth spelling out explicitly the challenge here. So the thought is that the very thing that makes death harmful and so motivates thanatization, namely desire satisfaction, is threatened by thanatization. This challenge has been presented in detail by Stephen Looper. So Looper says, look, when you face some sort of harm, eliminating that harm by producing a greater harm is not a solution. So as Looper says, it's analogous to cutting off your own foot in order to alleviate the harm of an ingrown toenail, right? If you're harmed by an ingrown toenail, you don't actually have a genuine solution in cutting off your own foot. And as Looper sees it, thanatization just does exactly this, right? So the basic problem is that for death not to harm me, I must eliminate any reason that I have for not dying. But that means I must eliminate any reason that I have for living, because a reason to continue living is a reason for not dying. But if I eliminate my reasons for living, then I'm not really going to have a very good life anymore. So as we've seen, the thanatization strategy rests on a desire account of well-being, desire satisfaction account of well-being. It is precisely because our well-being is grounded in our desires that we can reduce the harm of death by changing our desires. But then given the radical revisions to one's desires that are required, it now looks like we're going to lose much of what supposedly makes life good. So whether we go for conditionalization, or dropping all of the dependent desires, or detachment, whatever we go for, we're going to be forced to disconnect from our own desires, where we sort of look at the structure of our desires as merely a tool to avoid the harm of death. And in this way, we're going to become alienated from our own desires. Desire can no longer play anything like the role that it did before we undertook the thanatization project. I mean, suppose we grant that the harm of death consists in how it thwarts our desires. We should keep in mind that there are two ways in which I might be prevented from fulfilling a desire. First, it might be that my attempts to fulfill the desire are just continually frustrated. I desire I desire X, but X never obtains for me despite my efforts. So I'm basically in a position where I go without X despite my desire for X. Second, it might be that the desire itself is eliminated. I desire X, but this desire is never satisfied because before X is obtained, the very desire for X is removed. If death is harmful because of the way it thwarts our desires, then it looks like it's going to be the second kind of thing. It's going to be the second option, right? Like death is going to eliminate our desires. So it's not death isn't the sort of thing where we can say, well, it leaves our desires unsatisfied. Where it's as if, I desire chocolate cake. It's not going to make sense to say that, well, the problem is that when I die, I'm going without chocolate cake. It's like I'm in a state where I am without chocolate cake. No, the point is that death eradicates the desire entirely. But now, isn't that kind of the point of the Thanatization strategy? So, Thanatization tells us to remove or detach from the problematic desires. So if we fear death because of how it eradicates our desires, why wouldn't we also fear Thanatization? Thanatization looks like it's going to be harmful for the same reason that death is harmful. I mean, whether we think that Thanatization is outright self-defeating in this way, it does seem like there is something almost pathological about Thanatization, right? Where this project is radically reforming your desires in a way that totally upends your normal way of life in order to avoid the harm of death. What you end up with is a life that is wholly shaped by death, where the spectre of death strictly regulates who you can be. It strictly regulates the kinds of desires you can have, the kinds of things you can pursue. And you have to, in order to avoid death being a harm, you're going to have to always be sort of shaping your desires in such a way that, that they're not thwarted by death. So you're going to have to be constantly monitoring your own desires to make sure that you do not develop any desires that are vulnerable to death. But that means that your whole life is now going to be shaped by your future death. And it's not at all clear that this is a tranquil life. Maybe there's a sort of pessimistic conclusion here, which is, either we live with the fatal harm of, the harm of death, the horror of annihilation, or we live with a life that is just constantly shaped by death. In many ways, it seems much more appealing to go with the probably more common option of just ignoring the possibility of death, where it's intellectually I know that I'm going to die, but most of the time I just don't think about it, and I continue to pursue my projects as if I have an indefinite amount of time remaining. That seems much more carefree, really. Of course, I suppose it could be said that the problem with all of this is that we are approaching it in something of an absolutist way, as though the goal is to eliminate the harm of death. Maybe that would in some sense be the ideal, but you might think that instead of zealously trying to eliminate any trace of harm, another option is just to recognize that, there's these methods of Thanatization and we can apply them in moderation, and that will reduce the harm of death without entirely eliminating it. So, maybe we conditionalize some of our desires, or we detach a little bit from our desires, and the harm of death is going to be reduced, not eliminated, but reducing it is still an achievement. Although I suppose quantifying harm in this kind of case is a bit tricky. Let's take a person who has conditionalized, say, 50% of their desires. Are they then 50% less harmed by death? Seems a bit odd to assess it in purely quantitative terms like that, but I'm not sure how you do assess it. So, anyway, there's that challenge. Okay. So Luper also suggests a direct argument against Thanatization, what he calls the comparativist argument, and this relies on a comparativist account of harm. So to assess the harm of death and whether it can be reduced, we need to ask, well, what does it mean exactly to say that something, is good for me or harms me? What is harm exactly? The comparativist account of harm says, first, an event is good for me when it makes my life go better than it would have done had the event not occurred. Second, an event harms me just in case it makes my life go worse than it would have done had the event not occurred. So here we are assessing whether the event is good or bad, all things considered. An event may be bad for me in the immediate moment, but good in the long run, such as visiting the dentist to get a tooth fixed. That experience is going to be very unpleasant while it's happening, but it's going to avoid many unpleasant experiences in the future. So to work out how good something is for me, I have to compare how well off I am in the actual world where the event occurs versus the nearest possible world where the event does not occur. So take going to the dentist to get a tooth treated, right? Okay, that's a very unpleasant experience. Does it harm me? Well, let's say that my welfare level in the actual world, where I visit the dentist, is 100. Now consider the closest possible worlds where I do not visit the dentist. In many of these, I lose my teeth. That's a significant reduction in my welfare. So maybe my lifetime welfare level in those worlds is just 90. So in that case, visiting the dentist has an overall positive value of 10. Going to the dentist is good for me, despite how unpleasant it is in the moment, because doing so makes me better off than I would have done had I not gone to the dentist. Now, obviously, making these judgments is much more complex, right, than what I've suggested here. For one thing, how do we tell what counts as the closest possible world? That is a very tricky matter. What we're supposed to do is imagine a world that is, just like our world as much as possible, but where we just remove my visits to the dentist. We remove my visits to the dentist while keeping fixed all of these other activities like brushing and flossing and eating a sensible diet and so on, and then we play out what happens. Still, the very idea of assessing different possible worlds and their relative closeness or similarity, that's fraught with all sorts of technical problems. But hopefully this example makes sense for illustrative purposes, and I mean, there is something at least somewhat intuitive about the basic idea here, even if there may be technical problems. Now, it's worth noting that comparativism is compatible with many different views of what the intrinsic goods are. If we are hedonists, we will judge events in terms of whether they produce more or less pleasure. If we endorse a desire-satisfaction account of well-being, we will judge events in terms of whether they tend to satisfy our desires. And if we're talking about Thanatization, presumably we have a desire-satisfaction account in mind. And of course there are many other accounts too. But anyway, the point is whatever our view is of what the intrinsic goods are, we can say that an event counts as good for me when it makes things go better than they would have done had the event not occurred. An event is bad for me if it makes things go worse than they would have done had the event not occurred. For the desire satisfaction account, this means something like an event is bad for me when it leads to sort of fewer number of satisfied desires than I would have had the event not occurred. That's only a first pass, of course, because we might think that not all desires are of equal value. We might have to, weigh both the quantity of desires and the different types of desires. But again, hopefully you get the intuitive point. So anyway, that's the comparativist account of harm. Now here's the key point for Thanatization. On the comparativist account, I can be harmed either by enduring things that are intrinsically bad, so that is by having unfulfilled desires, or by being prevented from gaining things that are intrinsically good, so that is by being prevented from ever having a satisfied desire. So let's say I gain a great deal of enjoyment from listening to music, one day I become deaf, and maybe I'm wealthy enough that deafness in itself has no practical drawbacks, I just can't enjoy the music anymore. Still, it's natural to say that I've been harmed by the loss of music. I would have been much better off had I not lost my hearing, and that's because, listening to music is a source of lots of satisfied desires from me that now I'm just not going to be able to have. The comparativist account handles this kind of case well as being an instance of harm via, being prevented from gaining an intrinsic good. Now, clearly, death, doesn't cause me to endure things that are intrinsically bad. Once I'm dead, I'm not gonna, I'm not gonna be enduring frustrated desires. Perhaps I will, in some sense, be subject to something intrinsically bad when I die via the thwarting of my desires. Even though I'm dead, maybe we can still say that the desire that went unsatisfied is bad for me. Still, the primary harm of death comes from the deprivation of things that are intrinsically good. It comes from the fact that I'm no longer able to form any desires at all, so I can't have satisfied desires. On this view of harm, there's a serious problem with thanatization. The only way to ensure that death does not harm us would require altering our lives in such a way that those lives are not good for us. Because for the comparativist, if our lives are good for us, then clearly we are going to be harmed by the loss of those lives. And that's assuming, of course, that those good lives are not replaced by something else that's just as good. But, that is something we're assuming. We're taking for granted that death is annihilation. So this makes thanatization self-defeating, right? We would deprive ourselves of a good life in order to ensure that death does not deprive us of something good. But being deprived of goods is exactly what the harm of death consists in. Thanatization, therefore, means harming yourself in the very way that death is going to harm you. So this is one way, as you might have noticed, to really spell out this problem of self-defeat that we mentioned in the previous section. So Looper puts the argument like this. Premise 1, comparativism is true. Premise 2, if comparativism is true, thanatization can succeed only by ensuring that further life would not be good for us. So that is, thanatization requires that over the course of my life I do not experience more intrinsic goods than intrinsic evils, because if I did experience more intrinsic goods, then death would deprive me of them and thereby be bad. Thanatization would require eliminating the intrinsic goods or making it so that intrinsic goods are outweighed by intrinsic evils. Premise 3, thanatization is self-defeating if it succeeds by ensuring that our remaining life would not be good for us. Conclusion, thanatization is unsuccessful or self-defeating. Comparativism is a popular account of harm. It might be the majority view among philosophers about what constitutes harm. There are other views on the table, of course, but the point for our purposes is simply to note that the prospects for thanatization are going to be very much dependent on what account of harm we endorse, and there are independent reasons to favour an account of harm that makes thanatization very problematic. Okay, before ending, I want to comment briefly on the relationship between thanatization and Epicureanism. Epicureanism is a highly influential view in the philosophy of death. It argues that we ought not to fear death. Death is nothing to us, it's not harmful, and so we can approach death with equanimity. I have discussed the Epicurean arguments in an earlier video that I will link in the comments. Now, thanatization is sometimes presented as being part of the Epicurean project. Stephen Looper actually explicitly describes thanatization as a kind of Epicurean strategy. But there are some obvious ways in which these projects are in tension. The first is that Epicureans accept a hedonist account of well-being, not a desire satisfaction account. All that really matters for the Epicurean is pleasure and pain. Desire is relevant only insofar as desire satisfaction is a means of achieving pleasure, and desire frustration tends to cause pain. So desire satisfaction is an instrumental good, not an intrinsic good. The basic reason why death is nothing to us, according to the Epicurean, is because there's an absence of states of pleasure and pain. So, from an Epicurean point of view, the focus on desire satisfaction here might seem a little bit strange. The second thing that makes it a bit odd to associate thanatization with Epicureanism is that the Epicurean claims death does not harm us. Right? So when a person is dead, they experience nothing, so death is not bad. Actually, you might note, incidentally, that the Epicurean position is also threatened by the comparativist argument earlier, but that's a separate topic. Anyway, so thanatization aims to reduce the harm of death, which implies that death is harmful. If death is not harmful in the first place, exactly what difference could thanatization make? If anything is harmful, it's the fear of death that we have in life. Fear, obviously, is an unpleasant emotion, and so the hedonist is going to say that that's of negative value, and maybe modifying desires could help a person reduce this fear, but we shouldn't frame this as something that reduces the badness of death, because death isn't bad, right? All we can do is make ourselves better or worse off while we're alive. So I think it's worth distinguishing sort of two types of thanatization. So there's strategies for reducing the harm of death, and then there are strategies for reducing the fear of death. Throughout this video, of course, we've been considering thanatization as a means of reducing the harm of death, but we could instead see it as a means of reducing the fear of death. On a charitable reading of the Epicurean who promotes thanatization, what we should say is obviously not that death harms us, but that the desire to avoid death harms us. And then presumably any desires that presuppose the avoidance of death also harm us. These harm us by inducing the fear of death. When we see that our desires will be thwarted in the future, this causes us pain, and that's harmful, and that is something that might be removed by the thanatization of desire. Perhaps we can modify our desires in such a way that we remove the fear of death, provided the modification of one's desires does not reduce one's pleasures in life or increase one's pains. Then, we're going to say this is good for us. It would be good for us to do this. So that's Epicurean thanatization, right? Our current set of desires cause us to fear death, but those desires can be modified in ways that will alleviate this fear, and that would make us better off now. So I'll end by just noting a dilemma for thanatization as fear reduction. Remember, the point of thanatization is to modify desires so that those desires are no longer thwarted by death. Now, either fear tracks our judgments of harm, or it does not. Suppose first that fear does track our judgments of harm. So that is to say, suppose that my emotions are connected to my reasoning in such a way that when I determine via reasoning that something is bad for me, I tend to develop fear towards it, and when I determine via reasoning that something is good for me or not bad for me, I stop fearing it. Well, in that case, thanatization is just going to be totally superfluous. The original Epicurean arguments for the claim that death is not harmful will in themselves do the work of reducing the fear of death. There's just no need to engage in some, probably very difficult project of radically altering your desires so that they become invulnerable to death, right? It's just pointless, because actually, no matter, death isn't going to harm you anyway, no matter what your desires are. And if your judgments of fear track if your fear reactions track your judgments of harm, then once you see that the Epicurean is right, you're all good. You're going to stop fearing death. On the other hand, suppose that fear of death does not track judgments of harm. Well, in that case, it seems like there's no particular reason to expect that fear of death would be responsive to thanatization anyway, because it's not clear that what's really motivating fear of death has anything to do with a concern about desires being thwarted. It's easy to see how, I might make this judgment that, it's bad for me that my desires be thwarted, and then I come to fear things that thwart my desires, if we're assuming that fear tracks judgments of harm. That's what makes thanatization appealing. I can adopt new desires that can't be thwarted, so then I have nothing more to fear. But now, if fear does not track judgments of harm, why would we ever think that fear of death has anything to do with these thoughts about how my desires are going to be thwarted? So in other words, why would we think that fear of death, that the reason why we fear death is because we reflect on our desires and we see, those desires are going to be thwarted in the future, and and that causes me to worry? Why would you think that that is where the fear of death comes from? Maybe it comes from that, but there's no longer any obvious connection here. The real source of the fear of death might be something completely mysterious, completely irrational. Maybe this fear of death is just this brute reaction that's been built into us through millions of years of evolution, and it's not really about reflecting on anything, really. It's not about reflecting on your desires or reflecting on, what annihilation is or anything like that. It's just this brute reaction that we have because, obviously, it promotes survival and reproduction to have an animal that is avoiding death. If we go for... if we think that fear of death does not track our judgments of harm, then there's no reason to think that fear of death is going to be responsive to thanatization. Okay, so then the dilemma is, if we think of thanatization as fear reduction, then it's either going to be superfluous or it's just not going to work, right? If fear tracks judgments of harm, then thanatization as fear reduction is superfluous. If it doesn't track judgments of harm, then it just doesn't seem like there's any reason to expect it to work. And so there's a little challenge to that idea. And I'm going to end the video there. So thanks for watching. I will see you all next time. So bye for now.